It worries me greatly that we remain so dreadfully far off track.
Australia is within striking distance of reaching our point target.
We are miles from the goals of the Paris Agreement. Earth's vital signs are failing.
On the same day the world's biggest climate change conference kicked off in Dubai, the West Australian government was introducing its own plan to tackle carbon emissions.
The introduction of climate change legislation is a significant milestone.
The legislation includes a goal of net zero by 2050, but no target for 2030.
Every climate scientist will tell you this is the decade that matters if we're going to keep 1.5 degrees alive and if we're actually going to keep Paris alive.
According to the latest federal government data, Western Australia and the Northern Territory are the only jurisdictions where emissions have been rising since 2005.
Let me be clear, the net zero transition presents unique challenges for Western Australia. Our state has the largest share of heavy industries of any Australian jurisdiction.
For months, the WA government has been tempering expectations around its climate legislation.
Let there be no doubt, the bar is high for Western Australia. We're not Tasmania.
For the last 2 years, the WA government has been working on plans to drive down emissions across the economy. It released them last week in this 40-page document published online. There's nothing in here about what the state's emissions are likely to be at the end of this decade. 730 understands that the government's modelling predicts that in 2030, WA's emissions will be 2% below 2005 levels. Does that mean that we're not on track to meet net zero by 2050?
No, it doesn't. I mean, our pathway to net zero is unique. We have a significant number of high-emitting industries, particularly associated with our resources sector.
But I understand that the modelling shows that emissions would need to be 11% below 2005 levels by 2030 in order to be on track to net zero by 2050.
Well, I think the point to be made is that it won't be a linear progression. So we need to actually be cognizant of where we are now, the role that we will play to not only decarbonise our own economy, but decarbonise the economies of our region.
The federal government has promised to reduce Australia's emissions by 43% by 2030. All jurisdictions, bar 2, have targets for 2030. Queensland recently announced it's on track to exceed its 2030 target and set a goal to slash emissions by 75% by 2035. The NT and WA have no whole-of-economy targets for this decade. And like WA, the Northern Territory government has not made its 2030 modelling public. Do you accept that other states are going to have to do some heavier lifting since we're not going to be having a target for 2030?
Well, the other states need to look at their reliance on coal, both as an export and as a fuel for power generation.
Well, all other states' emissions are heading in the other direction.
We are the only state in Australia that will close down all its coal-fired power stations by 2030.
Well, every tonne of emissions not reduced in WA needs to be reduced somewhere else in the country in order to achieve the national emissions target.
The state government says while Western Australia's resources sector is difficult to decarbonise, it will also be vital in the race to net zero through the production of critical minerals, green steel, hydrogen and liquefied natural gas, a fossil fuel.
If not for Western Australia's natural gas, countries such as Japan and South Korea would have no choice but to use more coal.
The WA government is banking on carbon capture and storage, or CCS, to help bring its emissions down.
And $4.2 million to progress carbon capture utilisation and storage for hard-to-abate activities.
The technology is contentious.
It works, no question. The technology works. The problem is that it's cost, and also it's often difficult to capture 100% of the carbon dioxide. And also, the places we can capture it from, we have to capture it from, are very widespread. The places where we can put it is very small.
The world's largest CCS system, Chevron's Gorgon gas project, is located off WA's Pilbara coast. So far, it has not been very successful.
And so that is, to an extent, a cautionary tale about the technological feasibility as well as the economics of carbon capture and storage.
Professor Frank Yotso, who has worked as an academic and policy advisor on carbon emissions for the last 2 decades, would like to see more uniformity and transparency across the states and territories.
It would certainly be useful to have a relatively consistent system of state-based emissions projections, state-based emissions strategies, and ultimately also state-based emissions goals. Coming to a point where all states, for example, have a 2030 target would absolutely be desirable, not just from a public accountability point of view, but also from an industry and investor point of view.
And we need that level of transparency so that we can understand how, as a community and as a nation, we're going to cut harmful carbon pollution across the country. The WA government is fundamentally leaving it too long to have a real plan for cutting emissions by not establishing a 2030 emissions reduction target.
Will you make the modelling public?
We do, and we continue to work on that modelling as we see the opportunities come forward.
So when will the modelling be public?
Look, we'll continue to make information available to the community so that they can see the work that's been undertaken by the government to not only decarbonise our economy, but to assist the economies of our regional partners to decarbonise as well.